Good evening, my friends, and welcome to Moments with the Master. My name is Albert Dixon, and I'm the preacher at the Mill Road Church of Christ in Cincinnati, Ohio. And with me is my good friend John Henry, who's the preacher at the Church of Christ in St. Leon's, Indiana. And we're certainly looking forward to our study together as we spend a few moments studying from God's Word. If you have any questions or comments at the end of the program, you'll be provided that opportunity where you could ask questions or make comments to let us know how things are going, or if we can address any questions that you may have. So we encourage you to ask those things. The reason why we're getting started late, we have run into some technical difficulties, and we hope that we have ironed them out. And we look forward to studying with you, and perhaps you'll get an opportunity to look back over the study, but we hope and pray that you'll continue to stick with us and be patient as we go through these trying times. And we're in chapter 33 of the book of Exodus, and we're looking forward to our study together in these matters.
Okay, just a review up to verse 12 then, before we go on. In this particular verses 1 through 11, we see where the Lord's going to refuse to go with the people, the children of Israel, as He had promised. And as we begin in chapter 33 last week, we begin to see in the very beginning that God commands Moses to take the people up to the promised land, as you recall. The land that is flowing with milk and honey that He promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and then Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. And then the next thing that's going to happen is that God begins to inform Moses that I'm not going with you. And He says, basically, these are your people. So God is saying, I'm not going up in the midst. And God tells Moses why. And the reason being is because God says Israel is a stiff-necked people. And He said, if I take my place among them, while you act like this, basically, I will destroy you. God said that they were stiff-necked. It simply means that they were hard-headed and they were very stubborn people, if you will. And so, and then...
Yeah, I do know, John, that one of the things that we have mentioned before too is about God's presence, and so God not being in the midst of them shows their stubbornness, their wickedness, and that's usually what happens. Sin does that when we're disobedient to God. Again, it shows that separation, and then you have Moses. Where the tent of meeting is set outside the camp, and Moses has to go. Moses goes to the tent of meeting, and nearby, as we had mentioned too, is Joshua. He is there as well. So you learn these very valuable lessons of how important it is for us to be obedient to God.
I kind of lost my place and train of thought there for a moment. I'm glad you stepped in.
That happens a lot, I know.
But anyway, after this discussion, then we go into the part where in verses 4 through 8, where like I said, God says if He's up around them, He's going to have to destroy them, and so then. The issue becomes, of course, the issue with God is that whether or not God is going to dwell among or in the midst of these people. And another question is then, is the tabernacle going to be built? I think that's one of the things that Moses is inquiring to God about. Are we going to go on? Because we're going to see past verse 12, Moses is going to, start having this conversation with God. Basically he wants to know what's going to happen. And so he kind of pleads with God on that. And so, he's told Moses, I can't be among the people because of their sin. And of course, I will have to destroy them. And so His presence would destroy them because of their rebellion and their hard-heartedness and their stiff-necked. Now, while they're waiting on God to make this decision as to whether or not, what he's going to do, Moses said, what you need to do is take all them, all the jewelry, all the gold that you got from down there in Egypt, because that became an abomination in the sight of God, because they had just taken some of that and made this golden calf, which of course was an abomination. And to make matters worse, they said, this is our God that brought us up out of Egypt. And so Moses said, basically, I think it'd be wise if you strip yourself of all that stuff, so that God does not see it. And if he does, evidently, he'll come and bring maybe judgment against them at that point. And another thing I think, Albert, we see here is that, God is not going to be tolerant of Israel's sin. They keep lapsing already back into sin, and you begin to see it's wearing on God's patience. And so then we see, a little bit there, they was mourning a little bit. And evidently it was because, of removing their ornaments. And that's going to lead to the decision, from what I can understand, of what God is going to do with them in verse 5, when God was talking to Moses, when he said that I may know what to do unto thee, that is, the children of Israel. And so then the tent is pitched, as we talked about last week, far off from the camp, which, like you said, that shows God's separation from the people. And so sin always separates man from God, Isaiah 59, 1 and 2. And that is exactly what is going on here. And so he meets God outside the tent, and it's there that Moses goes in order to have fellowship with God away from the people. And so I think the tent then does two things. It shows the people that they are separated from God and from all, and God is separated from all that is unholy. And then the second thing that I think the tent shows is that, this is a communication with God. This is how God is going to communicate through Moses, the mediator, unto the people. And so in verse 11, of course, when we come to that, we learn that Moses talks to God face to face, as a man would speak to his friend, which I think is a very beautiful picture here. And then, of course, now we come to verse 12.
Yeah, and in verse 12, as you see from the rest of the chapter, is this really the heart of Moses, whose desire is to draw even closer to the Lord. He has grown in faith. And Moses says in verse 12, see, you say to me, bring up this people, but you yourself have not let me know whom you will send with me. Moreover, you have said, I have known you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. Now, therefore, I pray you, if I have found favor in your sight, let me know your ways, that I may know you, so that I may find favor in your sight. Consider, too, that this nation is your people. And so here's this recognition you see of Moses about God, and even wanting to know God. And this is this personal relationship. And as individuals have that desire to know God, God will reveal himself. Mm-hmm. And in this case, as we read the scriptures, as we desire to know God, the scriptures are telling us about him. It reveals who he is. Moses has the opportunity, as God communicated with him face to face, as verse 11 pointed out, and as you mentioned, John. So now here is this growth and this desire to even be closer to the Lord. And the Lord, and he says in verse 14, and he said, my presence shall go with you, and I will give you rest. And then he said to him, if your presence does not go with us, do not lead us up from here. So Moses' desire is, if you're not going to be with us, Lord,
Right.
what's the use in really going? We don't want to go. I don't want to go from here. Because you see this desire not only to know God, but this dependence on God
Yes.
from Moses' attitude and the things that he's saying.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Well, just one thing kind of sticks out here to me that Moses also has a desire, I think, to know God's plan. He keeps,
Absolutely.
you know,
Yeah,
he
that's
keeps asking God, like in verse 13, he said, "Show me now that thy way, that I may know thee, that I might find grace in thy sight." And so it seems to me, do you have any idea what's going to happen now? Is somebody going with me? You going to punish them, or just what's going to take place at this time?
And this recognition, along with that, John, is Moses even points out, he says, these are your people. This is your nation. And Moses is not taking the children of Israel for himself.
Right.
Because, he has been instrumental in leading the children of Israel. He has been instrumental in when God tells him to stick out his staff, and he sticks it over the sea parts. And when the people murmured for water, God provided that. And so Moses is identifying the people as belonging to God. And that's the way it should be, even with leaders of in the Lord's church, elders. Over and over again, they're told that it is God's flock. It is God's heritage. And so as a recognition of God's heritage, we are to, as elders, to care for, recognizing that the flock doesn't belong to us, but belongs to God. And we are to be the leaders, as should be, with elders and so forth. So this recognition, David, later on you'll see with David as king, he recognized that God was the true king.
That's right.
And even though the people, and he was anointed and he's in the place of a king physically, but he recognized God as being the true king. And you see this with Moses, that God is the true maker of the nation of Israel. And so they belong to him.
I think maybe another thing that kind of sticks out here that Moses is interested in, are you going to renew this covenant?
Right.
Because Moses come down and he broke, he was upset and he threw the 10 Commandments down and they broke. Now, it seems to me that might be, symbolic of, he just made this covenant, God did. He wrote everything down. Moses come down there doing this wicked thing, and so they're broke. And so when he goes back up again, as we're going to see, what does God want to do? He wants to write those 10 Commandments back down, and I believe it shows more than likely the renewing of this covenant.
Right.
I really think that in some of these things that Moses says to God, I really believe that we can see Moses' concern, because like some of these things, he reminds, like you said a moment ago in verse 13, he says, "Consider that this nation is thy people," because God, had told Moses, I can wipe these people out and start through you again.
Right.
But Moses is interceding here and pleading with God, and I don't understand. We don't know is, about the people. If they really understand what Moses is doing for them, if they really comprehend how he's going to bat for them, so to speak.
That's right.
So I don't know. I just find that kind of interesting there, that thought.
Yes, sure, absolutely. And then you look at the rest of the chapter. He says, and then he says to him, if you're, verse 16, "For how then can it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not by your going with us, so that I and your people may be distinguished from all the other people who are upon the face of the earth?" So here's that question. How do we know that we're in favor with you? And the only way really is by your presence with us. So chapter 33 continually puts out this theme of God's presence. And without God's presence, there is no relationship.
But I guess we could agree and say, the only way, beginning back at the Garden of Eden, he was with Adam and Eve.
Right.
But then God separated himself.
Right.
Well, because God separated himself, that showed Adam and Eve that, God hates sin.
Right.
And he's going to separate himself from it.
Right.
But why did that come about? Well, because they had broken the commands of God.
That's right, yes.
And they had done that here.
Yes.
And, this is it seems to me like maybe a very, very delicate situation, if I may say so.
Yes, absolutely.
And Moses is careful, he seems like, because of his respect for God, is to, how do I handle this to,
Yes.
appease God, to get him, to remember, these are your people.
Right.
And, this idea, how, like you said, how are we going to know?
Mm.
If we don't have a covenant with you, say, if that covenant's not there and you're not with us,
Right.
and isn't that true today?
Absolutely.
When we are baptized into Christ, what we're doing is saying that we are giving ourselves to God for His purpose,
Right.
and at the same time, we're accepting this new covenant
That's right.
that was written basically with the blood of Christ. And so this is some of the things that I see that's transpiring here at this time.
Yes. And really, as you're saying, the relationship in God's presence, on our obedience to His will, then we are distinguished from all others.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because we're following Him. We're doing His will. We're becoming like Him. And those who are not following His will, His presence is not with them. And they are not distinguished. They don't belong to Him. But when we submit ourselves to be obedient to God's commands and instructions, yes, we're saying, yeah, we belong to you. And whatever you instruct us to do, we do. Right. And that's what you're seeing here with Moses. And you have anything?
Well, I was just going to say, when they're at Mount Sinai, when they make the covenant with God, God says that you're my people, you're a peculiar people, a people for God's own possession. But everything that God said to these people is recorded back in 1 Peter.
Right.
And Peter applies those same words to us today.
That's right.
He said, you're a peculiar people.
Right.
Well, now we're the people for God's possession.
Yeah.
We're the people that He loves. We're the people that He's jealous of.
Right. That's right.
And so, it's no wonder God said that the Old Testament was left for our learning.
Right.
These are His people. Okay, now today we're His people.
That's right.
And so you can learn, we can learn a lot as far as being God's people and understand the severity of God. Absolutely. And then the closeness that we can have, the intimacy with God.
And these words are just they're just amazing, and the what transpires from verses 17 to 23, John, to further show this mm-hmm. presence, this relationship, this consideration towards God, and the wanting of God's presence mm-hmm. By Moses. Because he goes on to say, the Lord said to Moses, I will also do this thing of which you have spoken, for you have found favor in my sight, and I have known you by name. Then Moses said, I pray you, show me your glory. And he said, I myself will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show compassion on whom I will show compassion. But he said, you cannot see my face, for no man can see me and live. And then the Lord said, behold, there is a place by me, and you shall stand there on the rock. And I will come about while my glory is passing by, that I will put you in the cleft of the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take my hand away, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen. And so here is this revealing of God's glory to Moses. And it goes back to verse 11 again. God communication to Moses face to face.
this conversation that has been going on is this communication as friends sitting down talking. And that is a relationship when when it's like this. And then God, as he reveals his glory to Moses, that Moses gets to see the goodness of God and show and be able to proclaim the name of the Lord, his identity, that he is gracious and that he has compassion. And that's what all of this is doing here in this relationship.
I just want to, take the time to point out something, and we see this written in the Bible about God's glory, and sometimes people, ask the question, well, what is that all about? And we always say and teach that the Bible, is the best guide as far as trying to learn what something means.
Right.
If you go over to Ezekiel in chapter 1, I want to begin with verse 26 through 28, because what Ezekiel is going to do for us, he's going to define for us what the glory of God really is. And here's what he said. And above the firmament that was over their heads was the likeness of a throne as the appearance of a sapphire stone. And upon the likeness of the throne was the likeness as the appearance of a man above upon it. And I saw as the color of amber, as the appearance of fire round about within it, from the appearance of his loins even upward, and from the appearance of his loins even downward. I saw, as it were, the appearance of fire, and it had brightness round about, as the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud in the day of rain. So was the appearance of the brightness round about. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard a voice of one that spake. So there's a beautiful picture. He even goes back to the rainbow and talks about, the brightness and the glory of it. And he talks about amber. And of course, the color of amber is like, I guess we could say a dull yellow.
Yeah, kind of like the
and one of the things that I like to use as far as suggesting God's glory today is the sun. The brightness of the sun. You can't look at the sun in the face because that, if you do, after a while, you go blind. And, of course, if you do this with God, you're dead, because, that's why it says that, he said nobody has ever seen God and lived. I wrote down a few scriptures from the New Testament. I think it's important. I just want to glance at them for a moment. In 1 Timothy chapter 6 and 16, he says, who only hath immortality, dwelling in the light which no man can approach unto, whom no man hath seen nor can see, to whom be honor and power everlasting. Amen. Then, if I turn back here to 1 John chapter 4 and verse 12. 1 John, no, that's not it. Chapter 4 and verse 12. He said, no man has seen God at any time. If we love one another, God dwelleth in us, and his love is perfected in us. And now, let's see here, just a couple more. Verses 1, John chapter 1, verse 18. No man has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared unto him. And then in 6 and verse 46 is another one. He said, not that any man has seen the Father, save he which is of God. He has seen the Father. Now the reason why I wanted to share those passages and what it says. You've got the Old Testament that says, no man has seen God and lived. Now you've got the New Testament referring back to the Old Testament, telling us basically the same thing. But we've got people out here in society that says, I've seen God. Well, now, if you've seen God, you know, you got some explaining to do, you know what I'm saying? You know, people say, well, you know, I was dead, and the next thing I knew, I seen God. And then, you know, God told me all this stuff, and I come back to life. But, you know, it's not so. It's just not so.
Yeah, they have to explain what do they mean by they've seen God. Because, as you're pointing out, those verses, like especially with Ezekiel, the brightness, the purity,
right,
the holiness of God. He is the standard of holiness. There is none higher, there's none greater than that holiness. The purity, no sin at all. Those are the identification of God's glory, His character, His nature. When it comes to goodness, God is the standard of goodness. He is the pinnacle of it. There is none greater. There is none higher. Because when Jesus, I forget the passage itself, when Jesus says, greater love has no man than this, that one lays down his life for his friend. So Jesus is the pinnacle of what it means to have love, great love. That there is none higher, none greater than what He did for the sins of mankind. And you come back here to Exodus 33, you see goodness. Again, compassion. God is the pinnacle of it. There is none greater when it comes to compassion. Gracious. There is none greater than the graciousness of God. And so what we have to do is conform ourselves to that goodness, and accept that graciousness that He has offered. And then you look at when He talks about will proclaim the name of the Lord, the identity of who God is in every sense of its purity, goodness, compassion, holiness. And there's many other descriptions.
Oh, sure.
And those verses you went through, John, were absolutely pointing that out, and how important it is for us to grasp.
And I suppose one other thing I had jotted down as far as my notes there was the transfiguration in Matthew 17, beginning with verse 1, because you know, when Christ is up there and He took the 3 disciples with Him, and they didn't know what to think when they saw what happened, you know. But as I recall, Matthew records that Jesus, it was just a form of Jesus' glory. But the Bible says this about it, that when Jesus' glory began to show, that it was wider than anything on this earth. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I don't care what you take. You can look at the widest thing you want to look at. But it was wider. It was wider than that.
It was one of the incidents in another Old Testament passage or passages is Isaiah, when he sees God. And it talks about the description of His train filling the temple, and Isaiah's response was, "Woe is me," for he has seen God, and he considered himself as a dead man.
That's right.
Remember Paul's reaction in seeing the glorified Christ on the road to Damascus. He's blinded by it there. So you have all of these descriptions and passages that clearly show, and that would be Acts chapter 9 with Paul, and here in Isaiah, here just showing God's purity.
And you know, I don't know how all this works. I know what the Bible says, but you know, you've got, like we've already talked about in Exodus 24:10, the elders when they went up there and they said that they seen God, and they had but I would imagine that is something possibly like what, you know, God's going to do with Moses. He didn't totally reveal Himself, because, and that's what we need to see, because if He had totally revealed Himself, then like God said, you'd be dead. Because nobody can see me and live. And then, you know, Jacob said he saw God. in Genesis 32:30. Abraham said he saw God in Genesis 18 and verse 1. Ezekiel said that he saw God in Ezekiel 1 and verse 1. But, we have to be able to, look at just like putting a puzzle together sometimes,
Right.
You take one thing, like God says, no one has looked at me and died. Well, you take that as your foundation. Then you've got to build from there, I think. And
Right.
well, okay, now they've said this. What do they mean? Because we know what the foundation is. We know what it says.
Right.
You're not going to live. So what was the idea behind them mentioning these kinds of things? So.
Yeah. Well, my friend, our time is up, and it was good to have been with you and spending this time and studying of God's Word. And we encourage you to tune in again next Thursday, and hopefully we'll have all the technical issues taken care of, where we'll start at 7 p.m. And so we invite you to join us again next Thursday. And in the meantime, may God bless you as you continue to study His Word.